Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on the part of the world you're joining us from. I warmly welcome you to today's webinar, where we will launch the findings of a study we called the Status of Water Supply and Sanitation Regulation Landscape Across Africa, or in simple terms, we simply call it the landscape study. Today marks a momentous occasion for ESAWAS as we disseminate the findings of the study I just referred to that was commissioned some 8 months ago. There were a number of reasons we sanctioned this kind of a study, which I'll go through a little later. But the idea was to deepen understanding on what systems were at play in different regions of the African continent in terms of regulation, as well as monitoring mechanisms. Basically, we're trying to look at what was working or what is working, what is not working well, and then chart a way forward on how to improve the situation if need be. But during the conceptualization, as well as framing of the study objectives, numerous experts from all over the globe were engaged. Some of you are here today to provide input as well as perspectives into the whole study. Similarly, during the undertaking of the actual study, a number of stakeholders were equally engaged in respective countries, either to provide input or validate the information that was arising from these respective countries, so that as ESAWAS, as a team, we're able to come up with very credible, well-informed outputs. ESAWAS also put in place a team of experts we called the Joint Working Group to provide continuous backstopping over the whole process. And therefore, on behalf of ESAWAS, the chairman in particular, I would like to sincerely thank all the players and the stakeholders that contributed to the successful conclusion of this study. Let me mention that participants will be given an opportunity to engage via the chat box. So please type your names there, type your concerns or observations as we go along the presentations for today. There's also translation facilities that have been provided. So if you look at the bottom of the screen, there's an interpretation tab there from English to French. I believe it's not the other way, but English to French. So in terms of today's agenda, a combined team of ESAWAS staff that includes myself, Kasengahara, the Executive Secretary of ESAWAS, and my colleague Yvonne, who will take us through the presentations together with a combined team of consultants led by Harold Lockwood. So ladies and gentlemen, at this juncture, please just allow me to go through the webinar overview and then a brief about some of the specific objectives that led us to the study before I hand over the floor to the team I just referred to. So in terms of overview, the slide that you see there, we are going to look at the water supply and sanitation concept in terms of the coverage trends, and then look through the policy and legal frameworks that support regulation on the continent. So basically, we're trying to answer the question, to what extent is regulation provided for in those enabling pieces of legislation and environment at large? We'll look through the regulatory arrangements, in essence, trying to answer again the questions: who is regulating, what are they regulating, and are they using autonomous regulation, for instance? Are they using regulation by contracts or hybrid mechanisms as well? Then we'll look through the service provision arrangements, as in who's being regulated. Is it the private sector or public entities? Is it the local authorities or any other arrangement that might pertain in the different segments of Africa? Then we'll transition to the regulatory mechanisms. Basically, there we'll look at 4 themes: the provision of guidelines and standards, if they do exist in a particular setup, the monitoring mechanisms that are in place, as well as sanctions and incentives. And I should mention that there are very good cases that will come up along the dissemination webinar today. Last but not the least, in terms of the overview, we'll look at the environment. We're asking ourselves questions: is this entity regulating or monitoring, operating in an autonomous way? Is there transparency, and importantly so, citizen participation in the whole regulatory regime? Next slide, please. Then, as I mentioned earlier on, some of the triggers to this particular study. Of course, we do know that generally there's been progress made on water supply and sanitation, in particular water supply, but you see also cases where the sanitation in some countries is actually higher than the water supply coverage. But the reality is that progress has been very slow on the continent, and we're not intending to the desired pathway to meeting the SDG 6. But we do know and firmly believe that regulation plays a key role in improving service delivery, as it highly contributes to formalization of the sector, spelling out clarity between roles of the various actors via the provision of guidelines. And you agree with me also that regulation supports instilling confidence in a particular sector as far as private sector participation is concerned, or even attraction of investment in a sector, because we believe that governance arrangements are then well spelled out. But we are mindful that there is no one-size-fits-all approach, and the fact that the continent itself is very diverse, both in terms of culture and governance mechanisms. We can only pick one best practice from one region and facilitate cross-regional learning. So we believe, despite the diversity, that cross-regional learning can actually take place and could help accelerate the provision of water supply and sanitation services. Last, again, but not the least, you might be aware there's very little information as far as reference points are concerned for regulatory frameworks or mechanisms on the globe. And we believe that the study now provides outputs that will serve as reference points for all the stakeholders, all the players that are interested and are committed to enhancing water and sanitation service provision on the globe. Next slide, please. So initially, we envisaged that would comb all the 55 countries on the continent. However, because of challenges that will be mentioned later, we did successfully manage to comb 54, which is a very good accomplishment in any case. And the continent was divided primarily into 5 regions. The northern zone, comprising countries like Algeria and Egypt, the Western Bloc, which is more Francophone, and one of the bloc's the most countries, comprising countries such as Benin all the way to Senegal and Togo. Then the Central African Zone, basically the middle part of Africa, where you find Cameroon, the Central African Republic, and other countries in that sphere, the Eastern African Bloc as well, and then the Southern African Bloc. So in a nutshell, this study was carried across these 5 zones, even though we anticipated that all the countries being part of the AU would be combed. So, ladies and gentlemen, with those few words, may I now officially open this webinar and encourage you to be actively engaged. Submit your comments via the chat box. They'll be picked up and presented to the respective presenters for due diligence in terms of providing feedback. So God bless you all, and I hope you enjoy the webinar. Over to you, Harold.
Thank you very much, Kasenga. And I'd just like to underline, the significance we see of this study and how important it was for us as a team, recognizing the importance of regulation in a well-functioning sector. So it's been a real opportunity for us to be involved in this very, very significant study. Kasenga introduced me as the project director for the consultants team, which I'm grateful for, but I should recognize that the real work has been done by a fantastic team of my colleagues at AgriConsult. That's Bill Twyman, who coordinated the entire study, Analia Saka, Elise Jabaji, Julia Boulemois, our colleague Maya Gaynor and her team at Athena, and Amanti Consulting in South Africa. So just to recognize the vast amount of work that's been done. My job in the next couple of slides is just to introduce to you a bit the methodology and the outputs of this study, a bit around the process. So I'm going to withdraw from my video now to save on bandwidth. And just a bit of background in terms of the methodology, the approach to this. So we essentially designed a tool which we referred to as an analytical framework, which at its core is really just a very large Excel spreadsheet with over 140 indicators that are spread across about 7 main fields around legislation, policy, performance, accountability, and so on. And these were rolled out, piloted first in one country, Zambia, just to sort of troubleshoot, and then applied across the 54 countries that Kasenga mentioned. These are both quantitative in allowing then data to be aggregated and compared across countries and regions. So you get some identification of trends and patterns, and that's what the team will run through mostly today. But it also allows for qualitative aspects. So through the analysis of that data, looking at aspects of good practice, which I'll come to shortly, we're able to provide some more in-depth and nuanced insights. And those are really, you'll pick up in the various reports that I'll come on to talk about very shortly. How do we apply these frameworks? It was really a process which varied across the different countries. You can imagine that some countries in Africa have a lot of advanced documentation, data available. So for example, Kenya would be a good case in point. And then there are countries with much less in the way of formalized documentation, and that had implications for the extent to which we'd have to engage with stakeholders. So it really was a varied process. Once we collected the data, we wanted to really make sure this was correct. So we went through a process of validation, so sharing back with key stakeholders, the frameworks, but also the initial reports. And that would be done with the main regulatory actors involved, either an independent regulator or a ministry responsible for regulation. And in some cases where access was particularly challenging, we also talked to the main service providers and international organizations like UNICEF, for example, or the World Bank, sector experts who could help us to validate the things we were starting to see. Kasenga mentioned this joint working group, and I'd like to share thanks to them. I think they did a great job in giving us guidance, feedback at critical points in the study, and also help with engagements throughout the process. And you can see from the list there some very important regional and global entities, which I think will help with the engagement and forward dissemination of the findings of this study. Next slide, please, Bill. Thinking about then what outputs are coming, I think there's quite a lot of interest in these reports. So essentially, we started with an individual country analysis, and these were then rolled up and aggregated to first a regional scale, the 5 regions that Kasenga pointed out, and then continent-wide. And as you go up, of course, you lose that country-specific granularity, the detail, but you do start to then see trends and common patterns, looking at similarities and differences within regions, but also between regions. So essentially, we have 3 sets of reports. There are 54 individual country reports. Those are not going to be put online, but they will be available by requests. That's our understanding. The 5 regional reports will be put online in the coming couple of weeks. They're just being finalized now. And the continent-wide report, I'm happy to say, will be available now at the end of this webinar through a link. So that's a good incentive for everybody to stay online. You'll get that link and you can download the Pan-African reports. Importantly, and linked to this question of qualitative evidence, in all of the reports we came across, or all of the countries, I should say, we came across some good examples, good practice that's going on in all different sectors. You know, we know that there's better regulation in urban and in water than in rural and sanitation, but nonetheless, we saw some examples of good practice across all of those 4 subsectors. And I think this highlights the fact that there is a lot of learning potential here, and between countries in regions and across Africa about what works well, and not really simply relying on OECD examples and perhaps having more relevant examples of good practice. So it's really important, these good practice cases. There are a couple of other linked outputs which are slightly more internal, I'd say. One is this training needs assessment, which we've been carrying out in parallel alongside doing the framework, the analysis, to get views on what's required. You know, what do people want in terms of extra skills, capacity, and in terms of the training needs. And Yvonne will go on to talk about this, I think, at the end of this webinar. We've got information from a survey that we're still compiling. And then likewise, this final point on the slide, exploring the interest about establishing a dedicated regulatory association for the whole continent. That's work in progress. This will be discussed and taken forward by colleagues at SOS. So that's a run through of what we're really producing from this study. Again, it's been a great exercise. Really congratulations to the team that's been working on this, and also the SOS team. We've had great collaboration. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing people's responses. And I think it's over to you now. Yvonne, please. for the next slides.
Thank you very much, Harold, and good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Just a reminder once again to the audience that you can post your questions in the chat and we'll be able to respond at certain intervals. So I will be beginning the presentation of the findings, and we'll begin with looking at water supply and sanitation context. Now, I must say that the report itself has got quite a lot of detail, which has been synthesized at the continent level. So these are the continent level findings, and for the detailed findings, as Harold has just mentioned, we have the region and country reports, which will be availed. So in terms of the water supply and sanitation context, what we have seen is that services have improved over the last 2 decades, but it is not at a rate that would allow us to meet the SDG 6 targets. So we really need to have accelerated progress in order to achieve those targets. Africa in itself represents a very highly diverse water supply and sanitation context. We saw that the coverage rates for water supply services actually far exceeds sanitation services. This is something that we have known for a long time. But it is interesting to note that in 3 countries, which are Equatorial Guinea, Rwanda, and Seychelles, there the sanitation service coverage rates are actually quite high. Now, we had a struggle when we were looking at issues of coverage, in that up-to-date country reported data is not readily available. And this signals a very urgent need for countries to look at their data collection systems in how they monitor and track information about the sector. Next, Bill, to highlight the extent of this challenge, we've picked out one region, which is the Eastern region, to look at the latest available information from what we were able to source. And this is information which is publicly availed, so you can find it on the website or in printed reports. As you can see from this list, we have latest information from Rwanda, Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya, which is from the 2020 period. Everything else is before that, and we go even as far back as over 10 years in Eritrea, for example. We have 2013 in Comoros. So it tells you that the countries are not really updating this information for one reason or the other. And this is something that we need to strengthen. If we're going to monitor how we are progressing, if we're going to put interventions in place, data needs to be available. So in some countries like Sudan and Mauritius, we were not even able to get any information on what is being tracked by the country. However, we also have the GMP figures, which have been put alongside what the countries are reporting. But it was important for us to show what the country itself has as sources of information and where we are beginning in terms of what needs to be tracked and where we are as Africa, as a continent. Next slide. Looking at the coverage figures at the continent level, we came up with some sort of key to show where we are in terms of coverage figures. Now you can see that Northern Africa, when you look on the left is water supply, on the right is sanitation. So when you look at Northern Africa, you can see it is mostly in green for water supply as well as sanitation. Northern Africa actually has very high coverages, interestingly, 92% on average for water supply and 85% for sanitation. This is followed by the Southern African region, which has 73% coverage for water supply and 49% on average for sanitation. Central Africa comes in third. It's not a ranking, but just to show the trend. Central Africa, as you can see, has quite a lot of orange for water supply, which represents about 62% on average. Whereas for sanitation, you can see the amount of red, especially between Northern and Southern Africa. There's a whole lot of red when it comes to sanitation. And it is goes to show on the coverage figures that we have 35%, less than 40% for Eastern and Western Africa when it comes to sanitation. Eastern Africa, for water supply, you can see it's reddish and orangish, which comes up to 65% on average, and 41% for sanitation, which I already mentioned. And Western Africa has very good coverage for water supply at about 71% on average, but very red for sanitation. So this is what it looks like in terms of coverage. It suffices to mention here that we had to rely on the JMP figures to produce these maps, looking at the challenge that I've just highlighted in terms of data availability by country. Next slide. In terms of policy and legal backing, now what we should understand is that the policy and legal frameworks create the enabling environment. So we looked at what is available, what are the provisions for regulation, what does the policy say, what do the legal instruments say. So regulations should ensure that government regulators actually ensure that government policies are implemented and that service providers are held accountable. So in terms of the policy and legal frameworks, we found that 83% or 45 countries have national policy documents for water supply. And 81%, which is 44 countries, have policy documents for sanitation. Now, these are not necessarily standalone documents. They are, in most cases, combined water supply and sanitation policies. So where we have standalone policies for sanitation, these are very few countries. But what is good to note is that in a number of countries, the policy documents consistently emphasize the strengthening of water supply and sanitation regulation. But in terms of the actual detailed measures and the strategies to actualize this, this is where we have that variation. So in some countries, we have very strong provisions in the policy and also in legislation that enables the regulator to perform and established well. But in a number of countries, the provisions are quite loose, so it becomes very difficult to establish a very strong regulator that is able to discharge its mandate. Now, in a number of countries as well, the water supply and sanitation policies do specify objectives for reforming the regulatory framework. So we do find in quite a few countries where there has been a deliberate provision made for the establishment of even independent regulators. But unfortunately, these were never actualized or have not yet been actualized for various reasons. There is quite limited development of strategic frameworks for strengthening water supply and sanitation regulations. The policy is there, the legal backing is there, but the strategic framework, the actual strategy on how to actualize the regulator is actually missing. And even just a framework, a strategic framework for the sector is not yet there. So this would go a long way to strengthening regulation. Next slide. So in terms of the legal instruments which are there, these have been developed in all African countries. The legal instruments are there. However, there are substantial variations to the extent to which these address water supply and sanitation regulation, as I've just said. So legislative instruments generally provide a much stronger legal backing to regulating water supply services than sanitation. So for water supply, it is generally quite clear. But when it comes to sanitation, in some cases, it is just storage. In other cases, it is even silent. So there is that gap. So common challenges do exist in the instruments providing legal backing for regulating sanitation services. And these are issues to do with the fragmentation of the sector, the number of actors who are there, even issues of investment tend to affect who is charged with the mandate for sanitation. So these are common across many of our countries. Then an appropriate legal backing can exist for water supply and sanitation delivery. The legal backing is there, the instrument is in place, but it is not yet operationalized. So in some cases, you find a de facto situation as opposed to de jure. What the law says is not what is done in practice. So the legal instruments may be properly couched, but it is not what is happening in practice. So there is that gap. Next slide. So looking at the situation in terms of the legal backing, as you can see from the maps, a number of countries from East to Southern Africa and topmost North Africa, you can see that there are quite a number of countries which have very, very strong legal backing for water supply. But when you look on the right side at sanitation, you can see that really the legal backing for sanitation is quite weak. And the majority of countries have very limited legal backing. Whereas for water supply, it is only in few cases like Somalia and Sudan, where you do not find any legal backing for water supply, but some sort of monitoring is going on in terms of the sector. And when you look at sanitation, it is the opposite. Very few countries actually have strong legal backing for sanitation, and the majority are doing something, but probably at a very fragmented level. Next. So presented in a different way, looking at it from the numbers. So there are steps underway to reform or update key water supply and sanitation legal instruments. So if you look at Africa as a whole, in terms of water supply, you can see about 54% of countries have got strong legal backing for water supply, and only 28% from the whole continent have strong legal backing for sanitation. This is already a signal that much needs to be done on the sanitation side. It really has been a song that we've been singing that sanitation has been neglected, but looking at even the legal instruments that would allow intervention into sanitation sector, it shows us that we really have a lot to strengthen right from the ground. Next. I'll now look at regulatory models. This is looking at how regulation is implemented from country to country. So we have several forms that can be used for regulation. We have regulation by agency, which is an autonomous body from government and has the powers to regulate aspects of water supply and sanitation. Mostly it's economic and technical regulation. Then we have regulation by contract, which is a public entity, not a regulatory agency, but a public entity and a service provider who agree on contractual clauses. So they sign a contract to say how is the service going to be provided and under what conditions, including the tariffs, including the service standards. Then we have ministerial regulation. This is where a ministry is tasked with this monitoring or regulation responsibilities for water supply and sanitation. So it has direct oversight of the service providers. There is also self-regulation in one very rare country, which we'll point out, is where you have an actual arrangement for self-regulation. So you have a service provider who is also in itself a regulator because it can adjust its own tariffs. It is legally mandated actually to perform those functions on itself. Next slide. So what we have on the continent is that we have mixed regulatory arrangements based on different models. So you find in one country, you can have all the forms of regulation depending on the setup. And the predominant regulatory model is when we're talking about who's the primary service provider. So you can have a national service provider, you can have regional entities, and so forth. So we are showing in this map only what is the predominant regulatory model. However, the report has more detail on who is regulated under which model in a specific country and across the sector. So in terms of what is dominant, we have 37%, which are regulation by agency. So you find a lot of regulation by agency in Western Africa and middle of the continent, so east and southern, that's that band. You find a lot of regulation by agency. Then we have regulation by contract, which is represented by 28%. And this is mostly found in the Francophone countries. And ministerial regulation is 33% of the countries. And self-regulation, we only have 2%, which is basically one country, in this case, Djibouti. Next slide. So looking at it in terms of the numbers, on Africa scale, you find 37% of the countries, as I've just indicated, have regulation by agency. So as I've noted, this is mostly in Western Africa and followed by Southern Africa. And you find a lot of ministerial regulation in Eastern Africa, and also Southern Africa has quite a lot of ministerial regulation. So now responsibilities are usually split between several actors. This sometimes constrains effective water supply and sanitation regulation. Ministerial regulation is most common for water supply and sanitation service provision, and in most cases has been the default because the ministry is usually there before the agency or the regulatory entity is created. Whereas regulation by agency is the model that typically benefits from the strongest legal backing. And when you look even across the other aspects that we're going to look at, you find when you have a regulation by agency arrangement, it actually performs better across the board because it has very strong mandate and a very clear mandate. So in 22 countries, we have dedicated regulatory agencies. And there are different forms of those agencies. As you can see on the left, you have those who are specific for water supply and sanitation, those who are strictly for water supply, they do not deal with sanitation. And then you have the multi-sectoral ones, which have other mandates apart from water supply and sanitation. And as I've indicated, regulation by contract is common in North and Central African Francophone countries. Next. So I'll pause at this point. If there are any questions, any reactions to what we've presented so far, we'll be able to take brief responses. Kasenga, over to you.
Thank you very much, Yvonne, for that elaborate and eloquent presentation. Participants, as was announced earlier on, please feel free to type your questions, observations in the chat box, either in English or French, and the translation will be made and the question presented to their respective presenters. I should also mention that this webinar is being recorded, and therefore a recording will be provided a little later. But so far, I see no question apart from a comment that most African countries might still be bogged down with the MDGs and only using the SDGs as reference points. Perhaps that is speaking to your point, Yvonne, that generally access has lagged behind on the continent. We are still coming through the chat box. In case there are questions, we'll pick them up and float them back to the respective presenters. Back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think then we'll move on to Bill.
Many thanks, Yvonne. At this point, it's my colleague Anna-Leah who will be providing the next presentation on spheres of regulation. So over to you, Anna-Leah.
Thanks, Bill, and thank you, Yvonne, for that very comprehensive presentation. So moving from legal backing and policy and legal backing for regulatory activity, I am now presenting the findings on who are regulated across Africa. I'm presenting on the spheres of regulation. And by spheres of regulation, we mean the regulated service providers and the different service delivery models. Considering the diversity of the African country, of course, there are multiple water supply and sanitation service providers supplying a variety of services at different scales and levels of formality. So we basically group them into 6 different categories that you can see in the slide. And national and regional utilities usually provide networked water supply and to a lesser extent sewage services. Wasac is an example in Rwanda of this type of service provider. And there are also local governments that they directly provide services. We saw that they play a big role in sanitation services. For example, in Sierra Leone, the local governments own and operate vacuum tankers. There are also large-scale private enterprises, which are not particularly common all across Africa, but there are some examples like Sen-O in Senegal. They operate the pipe water network in the country. There are as well small to moderate scale private enterprises who usually provide services that are not networked. An example of these, and they focused on lower income areas. An example of this is eWater, which operates 150 prepaid water kiosks in rural Gambia. There are also, importantly, informal private operators who provide essential services, but who have not conducted a process of formalization, such as licensing or registration. And finally, community-based organizations who in Africa are the primary water supply service provider in rural areas, specifically for point water sources. So next slide, Bill, please. So one of the key takeaways from this exercise can be shown in this figure. These, of course, it's a simplified overview of the degree to which the 6 broad categories of service providers are typically regulated, and does not, and you can see that regulatory activity is centered on large-scale private enterprises and national and regional utilities, and less so on small service providers. This is, of course, not the case for all the countries, but it's a generality that we saw across the continent. Next slide, please, Bill. Another interesting finding from this study is that different regulatory models are often applied to different types of service provider. So, for example, in some countries, networked water supply services are regulated by an agency, and community-based organization or small-scale service providers are regulated by the municipality via the ministry. So this is not a surprising finding, because there are of course many challenges in regulating smaller and deconcentrated service providers. I'll list a couple that are kind of obvious, but first of all, the legal mandates, as Yvonne just explained, often are not clear for smaller service providers, small-scale service providers. And you can see the case in Ghana, where the PURC, which is the regulatory agency, has an expansive set of regulatory mechanisms for the largest service provider, which is the Ghana Water Company Limited. But other service providers are regulated by other actors, and these are regulated on a very limited basis. The type of regulations and regulatory mechanisms developed are also often designed for the primary water supply and sanitation service provider and the services they provide, so kind of neglecting the other types of service providers for regulatory activity. And there are numerous challenges in monitoring often scattered small service providers, which affects the capacity of the regulators. And finally, the data availability for smaller service providers that don't have neither the equipment nor the capacity or the technical capacity to collect and self-report data that regulators rely on. So that's like kind of consistent to what we found, and were also some of the reasons that we got from our consultation. So some countries though are taking important steps to extend regulatory activities, and the way they've done it is by tailoring approaches to specific service providers, and also they've relied on innovative solutions for regulatory activity. So, for example, in Uganda and in Senegal, there's a call center that's established for customers to reach, emptying, and transport the sludge services that have to comply with minimal standards. So that's a way in which the regulators can control the standards for these type of service providers. Also, it's important to conduct professionalization and formalization activities for these kind of service providers, in which they receive training on regulatory instruments, but also they're supported in capacity building and equipment, and so where equipment or supplies enables these providers to meet regulatory requirements, and they also have access to business support services like accounting or data collection methods. So some of these examples that are actually implementing like innovative approaches include Cape Verde, Seychelles, Rwanda, Zambia, and Tanzania, but it's not limited only to those countries. So now moving on to the different service delivery models, we also evaluated in this study if there is a difference in the application of regulatory activity on different service delivery types. So we followed a methodology in which countries were scored depending on the extent to which service delivery models were regulated. We divided these in 3 categories, as you can see in the graph: no regulations in red, regulations developed but applied on a limited basis in yellow, and regulations developed and applied at scale. Even though this is a very useful representation on the performance of regulating different service delivery models, I'll talk a little bit about the limitations of our methodology for you to know how to use this data. So this, of course, it's a simplification of the situation of each country, and does not show or present the nuances each country can have. Also, it was based, as Harold mentioned already, on secondary sources and in reports, and also the consultation with a couple of stakeholders per country. So in a way, even though we tried to standardize the scoring for all of the 54 countries, the degree to which the regulations were applied was qualified in a subjective manner. Also, in here for the continent-wide analysis, we analyzed only network piped water and point water sources as the service delivery models, but at a country level, there are other types of service delivery models, such as packaged water, water tankers, communal sanitation, and others that are also very relevant and important, but to facilitate the viewing of these results, we only included this for the continent-wide analysis. So jumping into the analysis for water supply, can you go back, Bill, please? What we can see is that the main message of this graph is that, unsurprisingly, network pipe water supply is substantially more regulated than point water sources all across the African regions, even though some variations do exist between regions. The best performing region in terms of network piped water supply regulations is Southern Africa, with 90% of regulations developed and applied at scale. And as highlighted through all this presentation, the region with the least progress both in networked pipe water supply regulations and point water sources is Central Africa. Now, continuing to sanitation, we can see that less progress has been made regulating sanitation services in general compared to water supply, and regulatory activities principally focus on sewer sanitation. So in summary, for all the African continent, 43% of the countries regulate sewer sanitation versus 11% for on-site sanitation. This situation is it's important because, to note and highlight, because even if it's the service delivery model that's regulated the most, only 13% of the countries relied in this type of service delivery model for sanitation services, and 47% of the countries actually rely on on-site sanitation solutions. So in a way, the continent is regulating more service delivery models that it's using less. In here as well, here the situation changes a little compared to water supply, and it's Eastern Africa, the country that performs better regulating on-site sanitation, with 29% of the countries developing and regulating on-site sanitation at scale. But as you could recall from Yvonne's presentation, it's in Eastern Africa presents also a very diverse set of countries in which the level of regulatory, as I may say, like development can vary. It differs a lot between countries. And lastly, from this graph, the last thing we found is that Eastern Africa, Central Africa, has very limited regulatory activity for sanitation, with 89% of the country not having any regulations at all for sanitation, and that's it. So the reasons for this service delivery bias are various, but we're going to highlight a few. First of all, there is a limited prioritization of sanitation, in which sanitation infrastructure is not valued as water supply infrastructure by the population, and in most cases it's even more expensive to implement. So as a result, government policy tend to favor water supply, which is translated to less developed regulations. So also regulatory mandates are less clear for sanitation, as Yvonne showed, and when they do exist, they are fragmented across different institutions and affect the overall regulatory performance. And finally, there is a historical service delivery bias, in which these service delivery types have been considered best practice in the global north, and have been replicated into other countries without allowing any sort of modification, which is also reflected on the curricula at universities and education centers, resulting in public officials who do not have the technical capacity to develop regulations for non-conventional alternatives. But to end in a more positive note, there are some countries that are starting to regulate on-site sanitation, and there's growing momentum around this with a new concept of citywide inclusive sanitation. And these show a very promising start to regulate this type of service delivery model. Some examples are Rwanda, Zambia, Tanzania, Seychelles, and Senegal, which we also found that the best performing countries in terms of regulating on-site sanitation, in the majority of the cases, were applying regulation by agency, with the exception only of Senegal. So over to you, Bill.
Well, thanks so much, Analea. Before Bill comes in for the next segment on the regulatory mechanisms, perhaps let's attempt to address the numerous questions that have come in. Some are direct to Yvonne, others I think could also be addressed by the team of consultants. So Yvonne, there's a question, but coming from your presentation, that is asking whether regulation by agents also means independent regulation. And also to the point that you mentioned that, yeah, there are legal frameworks in place in some countries and policy frameworks as well, but it's quite different from practice. The question is, what would the variance be attributed to? I think you can address those two questions, then we'll get to the other questions as well. So Yvonne, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Kasenga. When we talk of regulation by agency, yes, to a large extent, we are talking about independent regulators. Now, independence must be understood. There is a slide where we address that particular aspect, because when we talk of independent regulators, we talk about the decision-making power. A regulator is known to be autonomous when it is in charge of its decisions. It means it has the ability to adjust tariffs without any interference. So that kind of decision-making power is what makes a regulator independent. Also in terms of financial autonomy, that also makes a regulator independent. So in most cases, you find regulation by agency, because of the legal backing that it has in the way it is established, tend to be the independent regulators. They are autonomous in terms of funding. They are autonomous in terms of decision-making power. In terms of the disparity on the ground between what is happening in practice and what is there in the legal instruments, it is a capacity issue in one case, where the regulator does not have the full, say, human resource capacity or even funding to be able to discharge its full mandate. So you find in a number of cases, there is a lapse in terms of how the sector is set up. It is also about how the legal instruments are couched, how the policy is couched, that allows certain practices to happen which are not legally backed. So like we said, in certain cases, the legal instrument is there and it is well written. But in terms of what is happening, it is because there's a gap somewhere, probably in the institution that is monitoring or in the institution that's supposed to be in charge of ensuring the implementation that creates that kind of disparity. So it does have various reasons. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. There are related questions also, but I know you've provided answers maybe in part to some of the questions and maybe exhaustively to the others. They're quite related here. I'll bounce back one to yourself, that is about South Africa, that is employing ministerial regulation, but then the coverage from what was presented seems to be very, very high. Are there any factors, unique factors that could be attributed to this sort of situation? I'm not sure you did actually show the slide that had a relationship between the GNI of the country and the coverage in an attempt to answer this question. And also, there's also a question that you could answer relating to the possible conflicts of interest regarding ministerial regulation, because the ministry is the one pushing the policy agenda, but also providing regulation. What are some of the possible conflicts of interest in there?
Thank you very much, Kasenga. As you've said, the question is loaded. I'll attempt it at a very high level because we have a lot of detail in the report. As I said, ministerial regulation is actually present in 46 African countries. And these different forms of regulation are all present most of the time. The three forms are quite present in one country even, depending on the type of service provider that is being regulated, depending on the sector, whether it's water supply, sanitation, depending on whether it's urban or rural, you'll find that mixture in a country. But nevertheless, we do have 46 countries which have ministerial regulation. And the reason for that is because ministerial regulation is actually the first regulation that tends to happen. It is more or less the default, because at the time of creation, the ministry comes first as the one in charge of policy. The agency or the monitoring wing comes a little later. And that is why there's a gradual transfer of that monitoring oversight to a regulatory entity. And this is why we find a lot of ministerial regulation. But where you find strong regulators, even under the ministry, it is because the ministry has attempted a split between the policy wing and the regulation wing. So a different department is usually set up for regulation. Like in the case of South Africa, they do have a particular department. Even Uganda has a specific department for regulation. Of course, there's a conflict because on the one hand, you are the one doing the policy. On the other hand, you can't slap yourself for the same policy that is not being implemented. So you do find, as we go along the presentations, we will be able to show you what that results into in terms of performance on the ground for regulation and the sector. But you find there is some limitation in prioritization. There's not enough autonomy for the regulator because it's dependent on government funding. You find also issues of capacity. The department has to be small in line with what the government is able to manage. So there's all that limitation that comes in, and you do not have an entity that can fund itself and be able to discharge its mandate. But it's not always a bad situation, but this is why we said the adopted model is dependent on country context. So it's not bad, it's not good. We have to understand the context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yvonne, for those responses, and I trust that they suffice. But nonetheless, if participants are not clear on any particular point, please still feel free to type the comments in the chat box and we'll pick them for redress. There's a question that I will direct to Harold and team, and this concerns research, I believe, was conducted by Glass on regulation. And the question, did this particular research actually try to compare the regulatory data from the available Glass report and what was being done? Harold and team, please.
The short answer to that, Kasenga, is no, we didn't. So we weren't across that new data, as at least as far as I am aware. Bill, can you provide any further clarification?
Just simply to offer another short answer, Harold, that wasn't kind of a data set that we compared our results to, Kasenga. That is something that could be done now, depending on kind of the compatibility of the kind of indicators that we're focused on. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much for that response. There are a couple of questions, some of them are coming in French, and my colleagues, please help me in the next 2 minutes to just pick them up and float them to the respective presenters. Unfortunately, I can't read the French, but there's a question here. It's not very clear on my side, and it's talking about the regulation of water points. And the question is, are there any good examples of where this is happening very well? But if there's a problem, who then should be contacted? I believe this is more like the rural arrangement of regulation. Yeah, in essence, that's a question. I think anybody could pick it, either Yvonne or B1 team.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kasenga. So I think firstly to reiterate kind of the overall finding here, it's very much we see a bias towards piped water supply, with point water sources being a real challenge in the vast majority of countries. And I think in countries where we see progress having been made in the regulation of water points, it's often fairly incipient or nascent, albeit kind of an important step in the right direction. But I'll hand over to my colleague Analia now, who might be able to provide a couple of examples of countries which have taken important steps in the direction of regulating water points. I think we've not got countries kind of who would be fully satisfied with their work here, but have taken several important steps in this direction to start to regulate these at scale in a meaningful manner. But over to you, Analia.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. So there are some very good examples that I can showcase. So there's the example of Tanzania, who actually developed regulatory guidelines for point water sources, and they still haven't. They started already regulating point water sources, but it hasn't been applied to a whole country, and it's certainly not the strength of the agency, these type of service delivery models. As I mentioned also in my presentation, then in Gambia, there are some service providers that are being regulated by the regulator. And in Rwanda as well, there are some water points in urban areas where rural the regulator has released guidelines, and it's actually under the regulator's mandate to regulate them, and they are being regulated even though they are not being presented in the performance report. But there are some good examples, as I mentioned, the example of Rwanda, Zambia, Tanzania, and the Seychelles. But to expand on these good case studies, you can go to the continent-wide report and see the good case studies we have showcased there.
All right, thank you very much for those responses, Analia. I hope that they suffice. There are a couple of questions that are still trickling in. We'll still pick them up and address them at a later stage. So in the interest of time, let me hand over to Bill to take us through the regulatory mechanisms. And once again, participants, let me assure you that your questions will be addressed either be it in English or in French. So over to you, Bill, for the next segment.
Thank you very much, Kasenga, and yeah, thank you everyone for the great questions, and please keep them coming throughout this next section that we're focusing on, and we'll be sure to have a separate Q&A after this section to run through any questions. The next section that we're running through is on regulatory mechanisms, and this is kind of an area where we looked at the development and application of 16 regulatory mechanisms across the 54 African countries that Kasenga introduced at the beginning of the webinar. To begin with a quick definition, a regulatory mechanism is an intervention or process used by a regulatory actor to guide and influence the behavior and performance of key stakeholders in the wash sector, and in particular service providers. We looked at 16 regulatory mechanisms across 4 categories. So we looked at the development of standards and guidelines across 6 areas, and we'll run through each of these in the kind of coming slides. We looked at monitoring and performance reporting and 6 different indicators here. We then looked at 2 indicators or 2 regulatory mechanisms relating to regulation by incentives, and then also 2 regulatory mechanisms relating to sanctions. A few important points to note before we kind of jump into the findings here. Firstly, we did look to capture some more, I should say, anecdotal or light touch information on smaller deconcentrated service providers, be it water committees, be it vacuum tanker operators, for example. However, the main focus of our work in this area, and particularly the quantified information presented in the continent-wide report, and what we'll run through in this presentation, was on the primary service providers in each country. So as Analia explained, typically national or regional utilities or large private enterprises. Secondly, while we capture some qualitative information on each of these dimensions, the information we will be presenting is based on a kind of simple yes/no scoring. And like with the other areas of the study where we captured this quantifiable information to enable cross-country comparison, it does miss some important nuance. And I would encourage everybody to ask for the country reports that go into greater detail on each of these aspects to pick out some of the specificities that we simply can't present in the continent-wide report or today. Finally, I should say that we also varied a bit between these 4 categories of regulatory mechanism in regards to whether we focused on the development or existence of a regulatory mechanism or on its application or implementation and the scoring provided. So for standards and guidelines and sanctioning, we just looked at the existence of the regulatory mechanism on paper. So standards and guidelines have been developed and sanctioning powers exist. Well, for monitoring and performance reporting and regulation by incentives, we were a little bit more ambitious and instead focused on the actual implementation of these regulatory mechanisms because we were more confident in sourcing comparable information here across countries. The figure in front of you now details the 16 regulatory mechanisms that we looked at across these 4 dimensions. It highlights the percentage of African countries that have developed each of these regulatory mechanisms. I think overall it highlights that there are significant variations in the development and the application of each of these 16 regulatory mechanisms that we focused at. Of note, I think we see the greatest progress has been made overall in the area of standards and guideline development, and especially standards for environmental protection and quality of service. We also see that important progress is evident regarding the ability of regulatory actors to sanction service providers. However, as we'll run through in some of the subsequent slides, these sanctioning powers are rarely actually used by the key regulatory actors in each country. The greatest challenges, and this really stands out to me, are evident in relation to regulation by incentives, with only 30% and 15% of countries utilizing financial and reputational incentives respectively. And we also see some fairly widespread challenges evident concerning regulatory actors tracking an appropriate set of operational sustainability indicators, performance reporting, the development of standards and guidelines for citizen involvement, and also for pro-port aspects as well. So the figure in front of you now takes the information collected on a country-by-country basis on each of the 16 regulatory mechanisms, and it uses a relatively simple color-coded system to know what number of these 16 regulatory mechanisms have been developed by each country. I think at the very top level, and what really jumps out here is the very high degree of variation between countries across the continent. We've got several countries such as Burkina Faso, Zambia, Kenya, Tanzania, also Cape Verde, that have made really very impressive progress in terms of the development and application of regulatory mechanisms and should be heralded for this. Conversely, we've also got several countries highlighted in dark red and red where significant challenges persist, and a greater emphasis on regulatory mechanism development application is really required as we move forward in the aim of accelerating progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. Overall, we see that 13% of countries have developed 15 to 16 of the regulatory mechanisms developed. We see 26% have developed 12 to 14, and also 26% 9 to 11. And then if we drop down, we see only 20%, have developed only 3 to 5 regulatory mechanisms. And we see 2 countries, or 4%, being Somalia and Equatorial Guinea, have only developed 0 to 2 of the regulatory mechanisms and face the greatest challenges across the continent here. An important and perhaps more kind of cross-cutting point to note here is that where a comprehensive set of regulatory mechanisms have been developed and are effectively applied, this has typically followed an iterative and evolutionary process that has occurred over many years. So what we see is that when enacted, legal instruments often suddenly empower existing or newly established regulatory actors with extensive or expansive regulatory responsibility and functions, but it usually takes these actors many years to properly fulfill these functions. And we often see that it's many older dedicated regulatory actors, be it NAWASCO in Zambia, be it WASREB in Kenya, be it EWURA in Tanzania, that have made the greatest progress in terms of developing and applying a more expansive set of regulatory mechanisms, whilst more nascent, incipient, new regulatory actors are often kind of getting their feet, and it will take them several years to make progress in this area. The figure in front of you now notes the percentage of countries across Africa and each of Africa's 5 regions that have developed either a poor, so 0 to 5 regulatory mechanisms, moderate 6 to 11, or good 12 to 16 set of regulatory mechanisms. And this is kind of disaggregated both across all of Africa, but then also on kind of a region by region basis, using those grouping of countries that Kasenga spoke to earlier. By doing this, what we see is kind of noteworthy regional variations in the progress made developing and applying regulatory mechanisms. In the first instance, like many of the other forms of kind of cross-country and cross-regional analysis that have been done, it highlights that Central Africa performs considerably worse than each of the other regions that we focused on. Here, we have some very fragile and challenging contexts, such as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, but also some wealthier countries, such as Equatorial Guinea and Gabon, that have placed comparatively little emphasis on improving water supply and sanitation regulation. Broadly, we also see comparable and largely moderate to good performance across Western and Southern Africa, while Northern Africa stands out as performing quite well here, with lots of countries having developed 12 to 14 of the 16 regulatory mechanisms that we focused on. When it comes to Eastern Africa, this really stands out as the region with the greatest diversity in the performance in regards to the development and application of regulatory mechanisms. So you've got countries such as Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, Uganda in Eastern Africa that are performing very well across the indicators we looked at, while we've got other countries such as Somalia, Eritrea, Sudan, which have made some of the least progress across the continent. The figure in front of you now notes the percentage of countries across each of the regulatory forms, or the three main regulatory forms, I should say, that we focused on, that have developed either a poor, so again 0 to 5, moderate 6 to 11, or good 12 to 16 set of regulatory mechanisms. What we see is that no one predominant regulatory form is associated with the development and application of a comprehensive set of regulatory mechanisms in all instances. I think this probably isn't surprising to anybody on the webinar. I think after all, the development of a certain regulatory arrangement or the application of a given regulatory form does not guarantee effective water supply and sanitation regulation. And there are obviously many other factors at play here. Having said this, what we really see is that regulation by agency stands out for performing considerably better than ministerial regulation and also regulation by contract. So here we have 69% of countries where this is a predominant regulatory form that have developed at least 12 of the 16 investigated regulatory mechanisms. Equally importantly, we only have one country here where the predominant regulatory form is regulation by agency that has developed 5 or less of the investigated regulatory mechanisms. Conversely, we see while there are a couple of countries applying ministerial regulation that have developed and applied an expansive set of regulations, overall we see that this represents just 14% of countries, while 50% of countries where ministerial regulation is predominant have developed less than 5 of the regulatory mechanisms that we looked at. And then finally, we see that regulation by contract performs more moderately, with quite a large amount of variation between countries in regard to performance. So this is kind of the final cross-cutting figure that we'll run through today. And this is based on each country's degree of fragility using the OECD fragility framework. And like the other figures, this records the degree of fragility, but against the number of the 16 regulatory mechanisms that have been developed using the same 3 broad categories. This shows a clear linkage between the degree of fragility and the development of regulatory mechanisms. So most notably, and what I think immediately stands out, is that 50% of countries classified as extremely fragile have developed just 0 to 5 of the investigated mechanisms. And this drops down to 24% for countries considered fragile, and to just 6%, or only I think 3 countries or 2 countries that are considered non-fragile. Okay. So the next few slides kind of jump into some of these specific regulatory mechanism categories that we focused on. To begin with, the figure in front of you presents an overview of the percentage of African countries that have developed standards and guidelines for each of the 6 areas that we investigated here. So quality of service, tariffs, planning and reporting, citizen involvement, pro-poor, and also environmental. Overall, we see that standard and guideline development represents the category of regulatory mechanism where the greatest progress has been made across Africa, albeit with several pressing gaps still remaining and require addressing. In the first case, we see that environmental and quality of service standards and guidelines is where the greatest progress has been made. And conversely, we see that the greatest challenges exist in regard to citizen involvement and pro-poor aspects. Beyond kind of these headline figures, a few more kind of cross-cutting trends or areas of analysis are evident. The first of these concerns the considerable variations that exist between countries and regions in developing appropriate standards and guidelines, and also building on what Analia presented earlier. This is again an area where we see considerable variance between service providers and service delivery types, with there often being a greater emphasis in standards and guidelines on piped water supply services and the larger, more formalized service providers. Again, we also see regional variations here, with Central Africa performing notably worse than the other regions in this area, and Northern Africa performing the best. Okay. So the figure in front of you now details the percentage of countries for each region and also across Africa in the green box, where the primary water supply and sanitation service provider regularly reports to regulatory actors on key aspects of its performance, where regulatory actors monitor the service provider or validate the data submitted, and where performance reports are produced on service provider performance, either by the regulatory actor, which would be ideal, but also produced by the service provider themselves in many instances. What we see here in the regional figures is that Northern, Western, and Southern Africa stand out as performing especially well across the 3 investigated areas, albeit with some countries in need of improvement. But then we also see, as with most of the elements investigated, that Central Africa performs particularly poorly. And again, we also see that while there are some real examples of very good practice in Eastern Africa, notably from Tanzania and Kenya in this area, we also see overall poor performance in Eastern Africa, with no country in the region meeting more than, or with none of the indicators that we looked at being met by more than 50% of the countries in the region. Focusing in a little more, we see that while nearly all service providers are supposed to periodically submit data to a regulatory actor, this is done by the primary water supply and sanitation service provider, so typically a national or regional utility, in 72% of countries. Of these 72% of countries, we see substantial variations in the extent to which data is shared in line with requirements. And in many countries, where data is received from service providers on vital elements of their performance, regulatory actors often face persistent challenges in receiving this in a consistent and timely manner. So you might get, for example, about half of the service providers providing the regulatory actor with data on an ongoing basis, or you might find that some indicators data hasn't been collected on. This challenge, I think, is especially pronounced in countries where there are a large number of formalized service providers. So for example, in Rwanda, data is frequently shared by the main utility, WASAC, but data is not frequently shared on key performance indicators by the many licensed private service providers, and the fragmentation or deconcentration here does pose a challenge to regulation and especially data collection and monitoring. Kenya is, I think, one notable exception here, which really should kind of be heralded as a very good practice. And here we see that consistent emphasis and reporting from the Water Services Regulatory Board, or WASREB, on the submission of data by Kenya's, I think, over 90 formalized water service providers, has resulted in the percentage of these service providers providing the required data rising to nearly 100% in 2019-2020, compared to just around 25% from when WASREB was first established or first started data collection. And again, I think this quite clearly highlights the fact that regulatory mechanisms often take time and evolve over time in terms of ensuring their effective application. This study also looked at whether 10 key quality of service, economic efficiency, and operational sustainability indicators are regularly monitored and tracked for each country's primary water supply and sanitation service providers. And this is what is kind of presented on the graph in front of you. So what percentage or what number of these 10 indicators that we focused on are regularly monitored and tracked by regulatory actors in each country, again, relating to the primary service providers, with much weaker or much more challenging situations being found in regard to smaller deconcentrated service providers. What we see is that 17% of countries are tracking all 10 of the indicators that we looked at, and that this kind of gradually drops down as we go. So kind of 28% for 8 to 9 indicators, 17% for 4 to 5 indicators, and also 19% for 0 to 1 indicators. So the figure on the screen now highlights the percentage of countries regularly tracking each of 10 indicators investigated. Overall, it highlights that the greatest progress has been made tracking quality of service indicators, and that the greatest challenges exist concerning operational sustainability indicators. We see generally moderate performance in the tracking of economic efficiency indicators. Of the specific indicators investigated, the most progress has been made concerning water coverage, water quality, which perhaps isn't that surprising, while the greatest challenges, as I say, relate to kind of operational sustainability indicators, and specifically staff cost as a proportion of O&M, and also staff per 1,000 connections. Finally, in relation to monitoring and performance reporting, we see that in 56% of countries, reports are produced on service provider performance, and these come in 4 main forms. In several countries, we have highly impressive benchmarking reports detailing the performance of the primary service providers against wide-ranging quality of service, economic efficiency, operational sustainability indicators. In several countries where there are multi-sectoral regulatory agencies, we see what are probably slightly less impressive reports, which bring together bring together information on the performance of service providers across sectors. So, for example, combining water supply and sanitation data or information with information on other sectors such as energy, telecommunications. And these reports often present kind of key information, but don't go into the same level of detail as when a dedicated benchmarking report is produced for water supply and sanitation. In some countries, for example, Uganda, we see the ministry responsible for water supply and sanitation produces an overall kind of annual sector performance report. And this often outlines information on service provider performance, as well as kind of more programmatic information such as number of boreholes drilled or progress expanding water supply and sanitation coverage. And then what we also see in many countries where regulatory actors do not produce performance reports, annual performance reports are developed by larger national or regional utilities. So while we've got 56% of countries producing reports on service provider performance, in I think about 26% of countries, give or take a few percentage points, these reports aren't actually being developed by a regulatory actor, but are rather developed and shared by for example, the main service provider in the given country. Yeah. The figure in front of you now looks both continent-wide and region by region, and it looks at the percentage of countries applying a type of incentive to inform service delivery. And what we looked at here were reputational incentives and financial incentives. What we see is that most countries do not apply reputational and financial incentives to service providers to promote improved performance. Indeed, we see that reputational incentives are applied in just 30% of countries, representing one of the least well-performing regulatory mechanisms investigated. Nevertheless, we did still see 2 main forms of reputational incentives. The most common of these is the benchmarking of service providers in publicly accessible documents, for example, against each other, over time, against sector or international standards, and against comparable service providers, such as other national or regional utilities in Africa. In a much smaller set of countries, we also see that service providers might be given awards to publicly recognize exemplary performance or significant improvements. And sometimes this is interlinked or linked together with the reporting processes of the regulatory actor. We see especially limited progress in applying financial incentives to service providers, with just 15% of countries applying these. And this is the investigated regulatory mechanism where the least progress has been made across the continent. Nevertheless, we see that I think 4 main variations of formal financial incentives exist. And these involve, in one way or another, formally linking good performance by service providers to either increased tariffs, to tax exemptions, contract extensions or renewal, or also monetary rewards. We also see noteworthy regional variations in this area. And again, these regional variations largely follow what we see in many of the other aspects looked at. In the first case, we see particularly limited usage of incentives in Central Africa, with Burundi being the only country applying reputational incentives and no countries applying financial incentives in a consistent or structured manner. Conversely, in Southern Africa, we see particularly good performance in relation to the application of reputational incentives, especially in regard to performance reports being produced by regulatory actors and made publicly available. Finally, the figure in front of you now follows a similar logic as the previous one, this time presenting the percentage of countries where regulatory actors have a given sanctioning power. On this side of things, we see that most regulatory actors hold powerful sanctioning powers, with regulatory actors in 59% of countries having the ability to issue fines to service providers, and 74% of countries where they have the power to remove a service provider's license or terminate their contract. What we do see, however, and this is where the more qualitative information provided in the country reports is quite insightful, we see that these sanctioning powers are not actually really being utilized by regulatory actors on a consistent basis, with just 1 or 2 examples of this being found. The most commonly cited reason for this regards the fact that there's a shortage of alternative service providers. So in many cases, the ability to terminate a service provider's contract, for example, or equally to remove their license of a national or regional utility, really only exists on paper, as there are no alternative service providers to manage or deliver services, and this very much constrains the ability of a regulatory actor to apply sanctions. This is a particularly pressing consideration in instances of monopoly service provision under national or regional utilities, and also for kind of sewage sanitation versus on-site sanitation with fixed assets. However, it also has very real implications for most service providers that we see. And for example, a shortage of experienced private operators in rural and small town settings often creates lots of challenges in removing or terminating the contract of a private operator in a small town setting, for example, if it's not believed that an alternative private operator will be available or could be tendered. Okay. That's it for my presentation. So I hand it back to Kasenga now to kind of coordinate the questions.
Thank you very much, Bill, for that interesting presentation and very elaborate. However, there are a couple of questions that I'll forward to yourself, and I think the other two, Yvonne, could address them. So the first question here is asking whether the study considered all the regulatory mechanisms as equally important, or whether there were some that might have been considered to having a bigger impact than others in terms of the regulatory environment or the progress the sector has made. Further, it says in the same vein, were the mechanisms that countries should prioritize to put in place over and above others? So are there some mechanisms that are more important than others, and which ones, if at all, should countries prioritize? So Bill, I'll start with that one, then I'll go to the next one.
No, so thank you very much, Kasenga. So in this study, and for example, in the graph in front of you now, we don't look to be too normative in terms of giving a different weight to a different regulatory mechanism. We will say, for example, that standards and guidelines in relation to pro-poor aspects has the same weighting or the same consideration as, for example, the ability to apply different regulation by incentives. What I would say is, and I think I don't want to be too prescriptive here in terms of saying which regulatory mechanism is going to be more important to a country at a different stage of development. Or I won't say a regulatory mechanism is more important than another regulatory mechanism, but we probably do see a journey here in terms of that countries go through in regards to the development of regulatory mechanisms. So I think we likely see that standards and guidelines, for example, are a vital foundation upon which other regulatory mechanisms might be applied, really providing the different rules of the game that regulatory actors can then use to apply different regulatory mechanisms. Likewise, and as Yvonne was kind of pointing out right at the beginning of the webinar, we see that monitoring and performance reporting, so collecting data on different aspects, is going to be absolutely crucial in terms of applying different regulatory mechanisms. So if that's a key kind of foundation or building block, which isn't yet in place within the sector or by the regulatory actor, it's going to be very difficult for the regulatory actor to apply regulation by incentives be it reputational or financial, and it will equally be very difficult for a regulator to use its sanctioning powers. So there's a little bit of a journey we might expect to see here, with a regulator first kind of concentrating on standards and guidelines, monitoring and performance reporting, and then moving along to regulation by incentives sanctioning, whilst they've kind of got those rules of the game and performance data that are required to apply those effectively.
Thank you very much, Bill, for those responses. I believe they're adequate and they suffice. So there's another question from Neha, and she basically would like to know how the determination was made on fragility and effectiveness of regulation. I'm going to add another question coupled to that, which says, does the study highlight the strengths and weaknesses of the different regulatory models? So the first part is asking, how was the determination made between fragility and effectiveness of regulation? And does the report also point to the strengths and weaknesses of each particular model? So please address that. Then there are a couple more, 2 questions before we get to the next phase.
Thank you very much, Kasenga, for the important questions. So on the first one regarding fragility, it was really very straightforward. So we've got the data here, for example, on the development of regulatory mechanisms, which is presented on the graph. And we simply coupled that with the data from the OECD, breaking it down by countries according to their different levels of fragility. So very fragile, fragile, non-fragile, and simply coupling those 2 data points together to develop the graph that I showed earlier. And could you quickly repeat the second question? Sorry, Kasenga.
Part of the second part of the question is asking, basically, does the report also point to what are the strengths and weaknesses of each particular regulatory model? This is with reference to regulation by agents, regulation by contract, or the hybrid mechanisms, models.
Okay, no, thanks, Kasenga. So at the very top level, and I think as the graph showed in the presentation, we do see regulation by agency typically performs better. But what we also see is that when we're looking across 54 countries, we do get examples of kind of good practice or progress having been made across these different areas, for example. So if you take the example of South Africa, you might expect that a government ministry might struggle to hold local government accountable or to regularly collect data on local government and kind of put this publicly available, criticizing another arm of government. But actually in South Africa, they've got quite good performance reporting, which they've actually started up again. So what I would say is there's probably broad trends that you can point to, but when you're looking across 54 countries, I think it's very likely that you're going to see kind of examples from each of these different regulatory forms. I would also say we didn't do the analysis on this, but I would also say that I expect regulation by agency to perform better across standards and guidelines development, monitoring and performance reporting, and regulation by incentives. Whilst I would probably suspect regulation by contract to perform best in relation to sanctioning, because of the development of a contract gives you certain leverage over a service provider in that regard, even if it's not being used on a consistent basis in reality.
Thank you very much, Bill, for those responses, and I want to believe that they suffice. Yvonne, I'm going to bring you in. There are 2 questions here. There's a question from Funke, and I think this pertains to your comment that some countries have got the policies and the pieces of legislation quite well developed, but action is quite different. So the question is, what can be done to ensure the enabling environment to implement regulation is activated by governments? And there's a second question to that. What is the cost of independent regulation? Who pays for it? So 2 questions therefore for you, Yvonne. Yvonne, could you please come in?
Yes, I'm so sorry. Would you mind taking up that question, Kaseng? You can go ahead and respond.
All right, so the first part of the question is asking who pays for the regulation. So the piece of legislation, obviously, by which any particular regulator or agency is set up will also specify how that particular agency is financed. I'll give examples from what I've seen. It is usually the government grants. It is through the licensing fees, or other countries might call them differently, but basically license fees. It is also some agencies are actually allowed to do consultancies on which basis they can increase their revenue. So essentially, that is how they're financed. There are indirect ways of doing this. In some cases, the cost is actually just passed on to the consumer, added on the service, as it were. The other part is asking about the trigger. How do you actually activate where there's sufficient policy provision and legal provision, but there's inertia from the government? So how do you actually do that to stimulate action from the government to ensure that either the agency set up or the agency's function? I think this is where consensus building is very key. So you bring together all the relevant stakeholders and keep homing on the message, giving a nudge to government. But I want to believe that in any also government systems, there are flag bearers to any policy or legal instrument that is passed. And these guys or entities are held accountable really for the implementation of that. But there are also other avenues, other channels on the African continent in particular. You could use AMCAO, AFWA, or ESAWAS to support any mechanism. AMCAO in the sense that this is where the African ministers actually do converge for some of the policy or even legal instruments that are to be promoted in any particular country. So Funke, in case you need support, I think there are the bodies that could help energize in your country context, the actualization of those particular provisions. So Bill, I think there's a last question for you, but I believe that this has been adequately addressed. This is coming from Clarissa, who was asking whether regulation of service quality does include water quality testing. And in your slides towards the end of the presentation, I think this was very clear. So I believe that, Clarissa, your question has been answered. Ladies and gentlemen, at this juncture, we are going to transition as we get to the final stretch of the webinar, but please still do provide your comments or questions in the chat box, and as ever, we are going to pick them up and address them. So at this juncture, may I call upon Yvonne to take us through the further action phases. Over to Yvonne.
I think, Kasenga, at this stage, we're going to Maya for regulatory environment first.
Oh, apologies for that. Maya, please come in for the regulatory environment.
Thanks, Kasenga. Hi, everyone. Maya Gaynor from Athena Infonomics, and I'll just speak briefly about the regulatory environment. So we looked at 3 dimensions of the regulatory environment, autonomy.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, Yvonne?
Maya.
Shall I continue? So we looked at
Maya,
3 dimensions.
please go ahead.
We looked at 3 dimensions of the regulatory environment: autonomy, participation, and transparency. And I should note these are not necessarily correlated with the number of regulatory mechanisms, as Bill was just discussing, or the extent of regulation applied to different subsectors. But these definitely influence the effectiveness of regulatory decision-making and the legitimacy of those decisions. So the first that we looked at was autonomy, and we broke this into 2 parts. First, whether the regulatory body could set or approve tariffs independently without approval by another government actor, and whether they could finance their operations independent or largely independent of central government budgets. And this is important because this can insulate regulatory decision-making from political pressure and ensure that regulatory decisions reflect technical factors about things like affordability and cost recovery and quality of service. And where this independence and autonomy is lacking, political pressure, for instance, to keep tariffs low, can lead to a downward spiral of lower revenues and poor services. So regulatory autonomy is important for supporting good quality service provision. So in 30% of countries, the regulatory actors set tariffs independently. And you should note that this is largely in countries where there is a regulatory agency that is established essentially to perform these very functions independently. So in 94% of these countries where tariff approval is done independently by the regulator, regulation by agency is the predominant regulatory form. Similarly, 28% of countries have regulatory actors that are at least largely financially autonomous. And again, this is important to maintain sort of independent decision-making and ensure that the budget is not used as a lever for political pressure. And again, this is largely in countries that practice regulation by agency. So in the countries that practice regulation by agency, 75% are financially autonomous. And we had a question on this earlier. And so just to touch on the different ways that regulatory actors can be financed. One of the most common is to have a levy on regulated service providers. So for instance, charging a percentage on the revenues of service providers overseen by the regulator. For example, in Niger, the regulatory authority for the water sector charges a levy of 2.5% on the annual revenue of any service provider holding a delegation contract. Different countries have different percentages. For example, in Kenya, it's 4% on the tariffs paid to consumers by licensed service providers, but this is a very common financing mechanism. Regulatory bodies may also charge, as Kasenga mentioned, licensing fees, so a fixed fee for holders of licenses. For example, this is the primary financing mechanism in Angola. And it's also worth noting that in many cases, regulatory actors cover multiple sectors. This was covered by Yvonne a little earlier in the presentation. And often where we have these multi-sector regulatory bodies, they have a longer history of regulating the, for instance, electricity sector, and a lot of their financing for their operations comes from other sectors that they regulate as opposed to water and sanitation. So for example, in Lesotho, the Lesotho Electricity and Water Authority provided some data that 90% of their funds were from licenses or levies related to the electricity sector, and only 10% came from the water supply sector. Similarly, in Ghana, the Public Utilities Regulatory Commission is financed by a levy of a fixed small amount per kilowatt hour of electricity provided. So there are lots of different ways that regulatory actors can be financed. Next slide, Bill. So another dimension we looked at was public participation, which is of course important to ensure that regulation reflects the felt needs of consumers, the situation on the ground, and that regulatory decisions are understood by the public and seen as legitimate. In general, we found that participation mechanisms tend to be relatively light touch, such as sort of infrequent consultations when regulations are in development, or the establishment of complaint mechanisms. But we did note a number of really impressive good practices for ensuring more substantive and ongoing public engagement across countries. So one of the first ways that countries can do this is through voluntary oversight groups. So for example, in Zambia, the regulator has established what they call water watch groups, which are formally constituted groups of volunteers that kind of act as the eyes and ears of the regulator on the ground, and also the voice of the consumers, providing a direct connection for them to the regulator. And what these groups do is they do things like holding public meetings, they review and validate complaints, and they engage in awareness activities, and they also provide reports back to the regulator. So that's one. Another way that people can engage citizens more substantively is by having them represented in oversight or policymaking bodies. So a number of countries have institutions such as boards that oversee regulators and or service providers, or they may provide high-level guidance on policy and regulation. And in some cases, these institutions are legally required to include representatives of either civil society, consumer associations, or citizens. So an example of this would be at the very ground level, water boards in Ethiopia that are the most direct sort of oversight body for service providers and are responsible for things like monitoring and setting tariffs. And those are mandated to include often multiple representatives of the customer base. Another kind of example is having representation on a policymaking body. So for instance, in Cape Verde, There is a national council that's responsible for water and sanitation policy, and that's required to include a representative of the Cape Verde Customer Association. Consultations, as I mentioned, are often done with relatively less depth, but we did observe a number of instances where consultations have been really structured to ensure deeper engagement with the public. So for example, in Kenya, the regulator, WASREB, has developed guidelines that spell out the roles and responsibilities of the regulator, the service provider, water action groups, which are similar to the water watch groups I mentioned in Zambia, and civil society organizations, and what each of them should be doing to ensure regular, meaningful customer engagement. Regulators can also hold and facilitate consultations on a regular basis. For instance, in Gambia, the regulator does this with different types of consultation formats for rural and urban customers. And then finally, another good practice that we saw is having really empowered consumer groups. So for instance, when consumer associations have legal personalities and when they are formally empowered to participate in various specific regulatory processes. For example, in Tanzania, part of the processes that the regulator has developed include specific points where consumer groups are invited to participate and provide comments, for instance, during the licensing and tariff review processes. Next, please. And then finally, the third dimension of the regulatory environment that we looked at was transparency, which is critical for the public to understand the regulatory decisions that are being made and the facts that they're being based on. And we found that in 33% of countries, regulatory reports or data are made public, but there's a lot of variation in the quality of this information, how easy it is to access, how frequent and timely these reports are, and as Bill mentioned during his discussion of monitoring, the types of reports that get published. So as he already touched on, there's detailed benchmarking of service provider performance, which we noted in a number of countries. Often this is done where there is a regulatory agency, but not exclusively. And these reports really give you a detailed picture of what is being done specifically with regard to regulation and how service providers are performing on a number of indicators. And then another type of report is a broader sort of sector review that includes some information typically on regulation and service provider performance, but might cover some broader areas such as infrastructure investment as well. And I should note, regulation by contract by nature is often a little less transparent because of how the contracting arrangements work. There are typically some confidentiality provisions around the terms of the contract itself and around the performance of the service provider. And so in those instances, there's often reporting and data that's being generated, but is not necessarily accessible to the public. So just broadly, in terms of some trends, I should note that there is no region where a majority of countries meet all three of these criteria. And in general, the only instance where one of these criteria was met by 50% of the countries was in Southern Africa on the publication of reports and data, where 50% of countries do meet that criterion. In general, Western and Southern Africa have the largest share of countries that are performing well across these three dimensions, followed by Eastern Africa, which is kind of a mixed picture. And then there are more substantial challenges with regard to the regulatory environment in Northern and Central Africa. And I think that's all on the regulatory environment. We will hand it over to Bill now to comment briefly on some broader takeaways at the regional and continent levels. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Maya, for that comprehensive overview there. As Maya mentioned, I'll just quickly run through some kind of key takeaways before handing over to Yvonne to really specify further actions following the study. So in the first case, and running through here kind of region by region, we see that Northern Africa is a region kind of characterized by largely good performance in regulatory mechanism development. So of the 6 countries that we looked at, except for Libya, important progress has been made across the region in developing regulatory mechanisms, especially for standards and guidelines, monitoring and performance reporting, and the ability to apply sanctions. However, for most of these mechanisms, there's comparatively limited publicly available information on the extent of their consistent application, and the broader regulatory environment suffers from several limitations concerning autonomy, public participation, and transparency. Looking at Western Africa, we see that this is largely moderate to good performance in water supply and sanitation regulation compared to the other regions, but with substantial variations among countries. So at one of the end of the spectrum, we have countries such as Cape Verde performing very well, while at the other, we have countries such as Liberia and Guinea-Bissau that face considerable challenges in effectively regulating services. We see that the region has also made comparatively good progress in terms of establishing dedicated regulatory actors, and most countries perform moderately or well in developing and applying regulatory mechanisms. And there's several examples of good practice across the region which other countries could learn from. Central Africa, as I think has been highlighted throughout each of the presentations today, is the region facing the greatest challenges in relation to water supply and sanitation regulation. So Central African countries have generally given limited emphasis and attention to water supply and sanitation regulation, with many Central African countries reliant on ministerial regulation or relatively underdeveloped forms of regulation by contract. And even where regulatory agencies have been developed, we often see that these are performing worse than in many of the other countries across the continent. And ultimately, we see comparatively minimal progress in relation to developing and applying regulatory mechanisms, and also regulating actors beyond the primary water supply and sanitation service providers, such as national utilities. When it comes to Eastern Africa, what really stands out is that this is the region with the greatest diversity, both in terms of regulatory arrangements applied. So we've got self-regulation, regulation by agency, ministerial regulation, and regulation by contract are all predominant, but also in terms of regulatory mechanism development and application. So we see countries such as Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, where really important progress has been made in establishing dedicated regulatory actors and expanding and improving the application of regulatory mechanisms. But we've also got several often very fragile countries such as Sudan, South Sudan, Eritrea, Somalia, that face wide-ranging challenges in effectively regulating water supply and sanitation service provision, and aspects of the WASH sector, such as expanding first-time coverage, have often been given greater priority around regulating existing service providers. Finally, when it comes to the southern region, we see that this is a region of largely moderate to good performance when it comes to water supply and sanitation regulation, with all countries in the region performing moderately to very well, and a couple of countries really standing out for performing especially well. And there really are quite a few examples across the region, be it from Mozambique, be it from Zambia, or even South Africa as well, actually, where there's lots of very good practice examples, which other countries could learn from. So that was some kind of region by region findings. We've also got some kind of key takeaways looking across the continent more broadly. Firstly, as I think was picked up by Yvonne and Analia in their presentations, we see a real prioritization of water supply over sanitation when it comes to regulating service provision in the WASH sector. So to begin with, this is most explicit or most kind of clearly seen in some countries where you've got dedicated regulatory actors or regulatory agencies which regulate water supply services, but not sanitation services. And this is the case, for example, in Mauritania, Ghana, and I think also Gabon. But we also see it across the different aspects that we looked at more broadly. So even in countries such as Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, which are members of SOS and have made important progress in general in the regulatory in the regulatory sphere, we see that they apply a more sophisticated and expansive set of regulatory tools in relation to water supply than they do in relation to sanitation. What we also see is a real kind of diversity of regulatory arrangements. So while we picked out these 4 main types of regulatory form, regulation by agency, ministerial regulation, regulation by contract, self-regulation, we see that these are often applied in different ways, or these are generally applied in different ways with different combinations of these regulatory forms to different types of services and different types of service providers, ultimately resulting in a massive diversity, in how the wash sector is being regulated in each country across the continent. We see the best performance under regulation by agency across the different aspects that we looked at. So while all different regulatory forms can result in an effective application of a wide range of regulatory mechanisms, we see that this is most common under regulation by agency. And we also see that regulation by agency performs best across the different areas that we focused on, be it the regulatory environment that Maya went through, be it the different service providers and service delivery types being regulated, and also be it points such as the policy provision and legal backing for water supply and sanitation regulation. What we also see in many countries is kind of a growing prioritization of regulation. Many countries, be it Malawi, be it DRC, be it Angola, are taking very important steps to evolve their regulatory arrangement. And this is a key area for kind of momentum to be built up and impetus to be acted on. So lots of opportunities, I think, for progress in this area moving forward. And it's certainly an issue rising up the agenda in many countries. We do still see kind of a focus on the largest service providers, be it national, regional utilities and conventional service delivery types such as piped water supply over smaller deconcentrated service providers, which often serve a majority of the population in many countries. And finally, we also see many very good practices which are evident across the assessed areas. And I think Harold alluded to this earlier. There certainly are from this study, I think, and other studies, many well-documented examples of very good practices across Africa, which I think provide key insights, I should say, for other countries looking to strengthen water supply and sanitation regulation. And I think it can be particularly helpful to look at other African countries rather than looking up further overseas, be it to OECD member countries, be it to the North Atlantic, be it to some parts of Asia. But at this point, I'll hand over to Kasenga, perhaps for a quick question and answer, and then over to Yvonne for the next session.
Thank you very much, Bill and Maya. And yes, we're running out of time, so we really have to be quick with the questions. Let me reflect on the questions that came in from Eva concerning the private sector data, whether it was captured actually in this particular study, as well as what the plans are to build synergies with the private sector, because they've been operating in some space, particularly the on-site sanitation or non-site sanitation front. I want to believe also in the rural water supply and sanitation front. So Eva, I should mention that this particular study focused on the national statistics, so looking at those bodies mandated to produce or collect and produce the information, such as regulators or even the Bureau of Statistics, depending on the country arrangements. So to some extent, that data may have been captured, but maybe not so comprehensively, because the picture was at that national level. Of course, those particular subsectors, the rural, urban, peri-urban, were also considered. I should quickly mention that, yes, there is some progress. If you look at countries like Zambia, arrangements are being formalized for the private sector who've been occupying this space that was largely unregulated. So there are synergies, there are relationships that are being built with the licensed bigger utilities. And dependent on the nation, I think some of this data will eventually end up at those apex bodies for reporting. Now, to Bill and Maya, very quickly, there are two questions here. The first question is asking whether the study identified countries where the human rights to water and sanitation were enshrined in the policy and legal frameworks, and if this was also covered in the regulatory space as well. And then the second question is whether the study looked into countries or whether considerations were made with regards to operational and health safety of workers in the regulation of the waste sector. So if the study looked into those two aspects. So very quickly, over to you for responses.
So I was muted. No, thank you very much, Kasinga. Unfortunately, I've got bad news. I'm afraid neither of those aspects we looked at when originally kind of devising the analytical framework back in November. So I'm afraid we haven't got kind of cross-country comparable information on either of those 2 points. I imagine those would be points which are picked up in kind of some of the country reports as kind of key country specificities, but it's not something that we look to collect data on in all 54 countries. Yeah, so not an aspect that we can kind of pull together those top level findings on, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Bill. I should also mention that the entire analytical framework was quite huge. So it's time constraints, also financial constraints in terms of picking all the data. So we had really to decide on what was relevant for this particular papers. I have not seen any more questions, but in case there are questions, they'll still be addressed as we get to the last stretch of the webinar. So at this juncture and in the interest of time, please allow me to call upon Yvonne to take us through the next steps. Yvonne, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kathleen, and thank you very much for my colleagues who have shared this presentation and highlighted the findings from the report. Again, just to emphasize that this is a very broad overview. The report is quite detailed, and that is continent level report. It has a lot of information in it. And in addition to that, there are region reports which give more finer details in terms of what's happening in the region, apart from the country level reports, which now are specific on each country and what's happening in terms of regulation. So there are 3 levels of the reports, and we are just presenting the broad overviews of what's happening at the Africa level because we have very limited time to present the level of rich content that has gone into the continent report. So we have also put a section there which talks about what further actions we can have from this report. So we have briefly outlined some building blocks that need to be in place to have a sufficiently advanced and effective WSS regulation framework. So these are building blocks which are based on an enabling environment of having the policy and the legal framework in there. And we just have outlined where countries need to strengthen regulation or what they need to do in order to have an effective regulatory framework in place. So at the end of the day, implementing effective regulation really requires advocacy, and it requires continuous strengthening in order to be responsive to an evolving sector dynamics. Next slide, Bill. So from this, we have highlighted a number of actions that need to be taken by countries, by stakeholders, by SAWAs, and various other actors who can intervene in the sector. Here we've only picked out just 1 or 2 things that we're highlighting, but the report does carry several other actions and recommendations which we think countries and stakeholders should work on. So at the policy and provision level, we are saying we need to outline or promote implementation of guidelines, guidance documents. For example, we already have the Africa Sanitation Policy Guidelines, the SPGs, which look at how to develop an effective policy framework for sanitation. So such guidelines, if we had also for water supply and anything else that would improve the water supply and sanitation sector and how we develop the enabling environment, we need to have that guidance in order to strengthen the policy and legal frameworks for water supply and sanitation that will help countries to be able to point at good practice and pick that up and be able to apply it within their context. On the regulatory model side, we are not basically promoting one model over the other. We are presenting the status as it exists, country to country, and the impacts of that level of regulation. So at the end of the day, we need to establish the applicability of a particular regulatory model to a specific type of service provider. You might find that in the country, you may have multi-tiered approaches to regulation. It could be that regulation by contract is applicable to, say, the private sector, but ministerial regulation is, say, applicable to rural regulation. So that is a further action that we would like to take to be able to study those arrangements and recommend basically what applies best in the different circumstances. Then in terms of the service providers, as has already been highlighted, we need to expand the mandates and activities of regulatory actors beyond the largest service providers. We need to look at the smaller ones, where we're saying the sector is fragmented, particularly for sanitation, particularly for rural. How do we bring that under accountability? How do we bring that under regulation so that the citizens at the end of the day have very good services? In terms of the delivery, the service delivery types, we need to be able to research, document, and disseminate examples of effective arrangements and mechanisms. Of course, this is across the board as well, but we would like to share the good practices that we've picked from a number of countries. And throughout the report, including the region reports, we have highlighted a number of good practices where we think countries would be able to pick up something, and not just good practices. We've also highlighted where there are challenges so that we are able to say, look, there's this scenario, how best do we address such? Then in terms of regulatory mechanisms, we need to be able to develop strategies and partnerships to strengthen the performance monitoring and reporting at a continent level. You can't hear me anymore.
Loud and clear on my side.
Okay. So it means that for the regulatory mechanisms, as pointed out at the very beginning of the findings, we have a lot of gaps in terms of monitoring by countries, in terms of monitoring by regulatory actors. Information is outdated and you cannot regulate without information. So we really need to strengthen the monitoring systems at the national level, at the region level, right from the ground going up in order for regulation to be effective. Next slide. The regulatory environment, we need to develop guidance on how to strengthen regulatory autonomy for decision-making. What do we mean when we say regulatory independence? What is an independent regulator? What is an autonomous regulator? What are the features of this autonomous regulator? We want to develop guidance on that so that it is easy when countries are asking those questions, they have some sort of guidance or model that they can look at and say, okay, this is how it works when the regulator is called autonomous, regardless of the form that is used. Enabling and constraining factors, there's need to develop, there's need for capacity development interventions. This is also looking at issues of formalized training and regulation. Regulation is not a taught subject. You do not go to any university to learn how to be a regulator. You become a regulator through practice. But it has become very important, looking at how the sectors have been moving, looking at how countries have been moving, to say, how do we formalize training in regulation? And this is something SAWAS is working very intensively on. With other sector stakeholders to see how we can have formalized training for regulation, such that different countries can send their people to have some sort of formalized training to assist effective regulation. At the end of the day, we need to understand what is the impact of regulation. What does a regulation change in a country? What does regulation change in terms of service delivery? And therefore, we want to be able to gather this evidence and present how regulation impacts the sector, regardless of the form or model that is used to regulate. So next slide, Bill. So at the end of all this, I would now like to hand over to Kasenga and to assist us to conclude this very high top-level findings. The continent report will be available in a few minutes for those who've been asking for it, and you will be able to see how much detail has gone into that report and really get value from what has been done through this study. Kasenga.
Thank you very much, Yvonne, for that summary, very good summary, and elaborate one as well. Now, at this juncture, may I just call upon Engineer Kelvin Chitumbo, who's representing the chairperson of ISAWAS, to take us through the concluding remarks and also officially launch the continent report. As has been said, they are country reports, they are regional reports, so there's more information in there. And this was essentially high-level webinar pointing very much to the continent-wide report. So over to you, Engineer Chitumbo.
Right, thank you, Kasenga. And let me take this opportunity to thank everyone that is present. So obviously significant work is now required in many African countries to translate policy objectives or the provision set out in the legal instruments into strengthened or reformed regulatory framework. The findings of this study should be able to guide various interventions and actions by sector players towards improving sector performance. Obviously, we need to look at multi-level dissemination in terms of what has come out from these reports from July onwards on a number of thematic areas of this study findings. The study further presents a springboard towards strengthening regulation across Africa through advocacy, technical assistance, collaboration, and synergies. It is envisaged that a dedicated Africa-wide water supply and sanitation regulatory association will be an opportune to be established for strengthening regulation at a larger scale across the continent through collaboration. The first Africa Water Supply and Sanitation Regulatory meeting will be held from 15th to 18th November this year in Zanzibar. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, it is now my singular honor to declare the water supply and sanitation regulatory landscape across Africa report officially launched. And we hope that this report would be a guide to many as we try to refocus our regulation and also improve what we do. So with that, let me say thank you so much. And thank you for the people that put together this report. It would definitely go a long way in improving what we do. Thank you so much, and God bless you.
Thank you very much, Engineer Chitumbo. So, ladies and gentlemen, the report has officially been launched and it's available now for sharing. We'll still have a window for engagement. We can decipher so much from it as we've heard during the course of this webinar. There has been progress on the water supply sanitation front, maybe not so much, particularly on sanitation. There are some areas that we are doing well regarding the regulatory models, but in other aspects, there are areas that need to be strengthened. If you looked at the mechanism that was presented, over the 16 aspects, some countries have done well, others have not done too well. So that simply means that there is opportunity for cross-country and cross-regional learning. That said, ladies and gentlemen, it's been a long day. I just want to thank everybody for your participation and for active engagement. All your questions and recommendations have been taken into account. And at this juncture, I declare the webinar closed. God bless you all and enjoy the rest of the day.